At least it's not quite as cold inside. And I'm just really delighted that we're getting to that. I love this book. It's absolutely gorgeous. I know probably you haven't read it yet because you didn't have it. But I hope you will love it as much as I did. And now we start, Rebe's gonna start with reading a little bit of the book and we'll start a conversation.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, friends, current I get to meet. I'm so happy that you're here to help launch this book. And I'm just going to read the first page and a half, just to kind of invite us into the book, the world of the book. Can you hear me in the back? So this is a book that tells the story of a daughter whose search for her mother 30 years after her death brings her face to face with the gods and the ghosts and the saints of Cuba. And that daughter is me. And the book opens with me in Cuba, searching for my mother. I'd like to start by saying that my mother is not Cuban and neither am I, which makes the story less of the expected journey or linear narrative. The things that drew me to Cuba and that drew me to find my mother in Cuba there were a surprise. But we start with me already in Cuba, and it's 30 years after she's died. And I've gone to meet with a spiritist in the small town of El Cobre, which is on the eastern part of the island. And I've asked him if he's able to summon my mother's spirit. What have you come for? Madeline asks. And there it is, the question I've been circling ever since I first heard of a spiritist in the small mountain town of El Cobre who talks with the dead. With friends and family, I hardly dared speak of Madeline. When I had, I treated the possibility of this visit as a lark, exaggerating the more salacious details, telepathy, the raising of the dead, omitting the part I kept secret even to myself, that I'd come not as observer, but participant, that I wanted desperately to talk to my mother. It had been decades since I'd heard her voice, the sound of it filling our house with scales and arpeggios as she washed the dishes, pouring out the front door to call me in from a game of flashlight tag in the cul-de-sac. Becky, it's time to come in for dinner. The last time I spoke with her, I was a sophomore in college, and she was dying in a hospital bed in St. Louis. She was 59. 30 years later, I've come to Cuba in search of her, and that has led me to the house of Madeline. In his 60s, he looks almost preppy in a striped shirt and shorts. His gray hair is cropped short to his head, and he has a neatly trimmed mustache. An espiritista cruzado, he calls on both African and Catholic gods to help him cross the threshold and speak with the dead. His reputation had made its way to me where I live in Ohio. It was said that in his sessions, the spirits overtook Madeline so completely, speaking through him in a mix of Spanish and Bosal, an almost extinct language of enslaved Africans, that his wife, Silas, needed to be present in order to translate. Now, on a break from her job at the post office, Silas slips through the door of Madeline's workroom and joins us at one of the 3 wooden chairs he's placed at the center of the room. Her face is kind and round, her gray hair pulled back in a long braid. Around us, every surface of Madeline's workroom spills over with the objects that bridge this space with the realm of the spirits. Statues of saints clustered near jars of feathers and stones, water goblets filled with photographs of the dead, bells and maracas, Buddhas and cigars. I look across at Madeline. With his neatly cropped hair and sparkling eyes, he defies any portrait I had in my head of the sort of man who might live among such things. The real deal, the people of El Cobre call Madeline. As a child, he could see things no one else could. Spirits looking through windows, shaking his bed at night. Mama, close the curtains, he told his mother, who couldn't see what he did. There are dead people looking at us.
So this book, well, it works on so many levels. When I first was reading it and we tried to explain to somebody what I was reading, 20 minutes later, you sort of like, okay. But you said it so succinctly and fabulously at the beginning here. And the thing is, it does work on so many levels. That, first of all, being this exploration of your grief over the loss of your mother at such a young age. And then, I've seen it, a couple reviews called travel log, but it's deeper than travel log. It's more like it's really deeply researched cultural anthropology, but so beautifully written. It's disengaging, this travel log, deep into stories and histories about so much that, I never imagined, this journey this is where it would take us as readers. And then, of course, the spiritual journey is deepest. And all of these you thread together. They're vignettes, little vignettes throughout the book that kind of go back and forth from the present journey that you're on, physically, literally in Cuba, and the reflections on your life growing up, and then sort of factual stuff about even the Orisha, and the melding of these religions, which I do want you to talk about a little bit. But it's just gorgeous. And what I'm wondering is, you took this trip 10 years ago?
So the book, the narrative spine of the book, the story, the thing that propels you forward, is a 30-day period that I spent in Cuba in 2013, when I went specifically to connect with my mother's spirit. And I did it then because I had to. I don't know if you've ever had a time in your life where just something grabbed you and pulled you and said, you're going to do this thing. And a couple factors factored into that. One is, and there are people in this room who know this very intimately because they were my friends. At the time, I lost my mother when I was 19. And my mother, I grew up here in St. Louis. I lost her when I was 19, and I think that we all have a relationship. We can't come into this world without having a relationship with a mother. And it might be a positive one, it might be a negative one, it might be fraught, it might be joyous, it might be many things. And we also grow up with an idea of the mother and what she should be or must be or what we want her to be, right? There's a lot that goes into our relationships with our mothers. And I was very close with my mother. And when she died at the age of 19, I was bereft, absolutely bereft. And I was a sophomore in college. And the conventional wisdom I received from very well-meaning college counselors was, hey, get over it. She's gone. That was then. You've got exams to study for, right? You've got a life ahead of you. You've got, make something of yourself. Don't be fretting. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? But that was really the thrust of the advice that I got, was to keep moving. And I excelled at that advice. I was very good at moving, right? And moving forward and making something of myself. And but I lost a lot in that process because I never sat fully with the grief. And so 30 years later, right? I was 49, and this is bringing us to 2013. I was nearing the age my mother had been when she died. And I was also nearing an age where I thought, at age 50, a person feels like a real adult in the world. And a woman certainly has figured out how to be a woman by the age of 50, right? And I see some people in the room being like laughing, like, right? Like, so I'm not the only one who who thought that's the way life was going to be. But at 50, I didn't feel like a grown woman. I didn't feel like I had figured out the mysteries of life. I felt like I was still a 19-year-old girl who missed her mother and who was in very much looking for someone to show me the way. And I didn't feel there were role models in my own culture that allowed me and it provided the kind of example of the kind of woman I wanted to be. So I kind of went through a little bit of a thing, right? And 49 is the 30th anniversary of my mother's death. I'm aching for her. I'm missing her more than ever. And I have this question in my head. If I've done such a good job of moving forward with my life, if I've done such a good job of putting her behind me, if I can barely remember her, then what am I aching for? What is this deep, deep longing for the mother? What is the mother? And where does one find that? And again, in my experience, I didn't have an answer for that I found in my own country. But I had been a dancer. I'd been a Latin dancer, and I'd spent a lot of time in Cuba working with choreographers. And so I was familiar with the spiritual traditions of Cuba, which are varied and rich and deep. And too many to name and talk about, but the primary ones that I went to explore and talk about in the book are Santeria, which is an Afro-Cuban religion, and folk Catholicism. And I went specifically to connect with those traditions for two reasons. One is there's a deep belief that we shouldn't move on from the dead. The dead are part of us, and that they're very much with us, and that they're guiding and whispering in our ear and protecting us. And that all we need to do is open the door to that guidance, right? Which was so different from what I had grown up with. The other thing that was very different in Cuba was the idea of the spiritual mother, not just the biological mother, but this idea and this template for a spiritual mother who holds us all, who, unlike our biological mothers, and I mean, I am a biological mother. I had one and I am one, and so I know how flawed we are as individual mothers. It's impossible to get it all right, right? But the spiritual mother is different. The spiritual mother holds us, right? And so there were the pilgrimage that I set out on in 2013 was to find that doorway back to my mother through these spiritual traditions.
Before I ask the question I'm going to ask about that, I wonder if you would, speaking about the early, missing of your mother, was the top of page 50 here. If you don't want to read it, you don't have to.
Oh, okay. Page 50 from My Mother in Havana. I hear it's a good book. There are those who might say that losing my mother at such a young age, compounded by my inability after all these years to stop grieving that loss, creates an emotional hole that keeps me from individuating. While I rebelled against my mother as a teen, I'd missed that thing daughters who keep their mothers into their adulthood get to both complain and brag about. That face-off when two grown women circle one another to decide how much they are alike and how much they differ from one another. The push to decide, I am or I am not my mother.
That was just such a kind of aha moment, right off the bat in this book. So over 10 years ago, you set off on the journey, the spiritual journey, which I want to ask more about, but also, when did you know that you would write about this? And what did you think you were going to be writing when you started?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So I set out, I was at the time in 2013, I was a graduate student. I was in my late 40s, but I went back to graduate school to get a MFA in creative writing. And so I was in the midst of writing as I was having this kind of these deep questions and this quest that I wanted to go on. I thought I was working on a collection of essays that would be, each one would be in some way about the mother, my mother, the mother. I was obviously interested in this topic. This was something that was very much in my heart and my bones at the time. Thought I was going to do a essay collection. I thought I would go to Cuba, not to write so much. I went to Cuba to have the experience there. But I thought maybe it'll end up being one of the essays in the collection. You know, when I come back, maybe I'll write about it. So I went to Cuba. I spent 30 days there. I gave myself assignments. I went by myself. I spent the first 15 days in Havana, working with Santeria priests and priestesses, really immersing myself in the dances and the sacrifices that summon the gods, which are known as orishas. And then I spent 15 days on the eastern part of the island, involved in these pilgrimages, 10,000 strong, to the spiritual mother that descend on this sanctuary of Our Lady of Charity, who's Cuba's patron saint. And I wanted to get swept up in that kind of fervor and excitement and celebration for the mother. Because all I had in mind as a reference point was Mother's Day, right? By Mom Flowers. And, right, this was 10,000 people climbing on their hands and knees from across the island of Cuba to celebrate the mother. I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to see what that looked like. I wanted to feel what that would feel like. And I'd heard about Madeline, who I'd heard all the way from Ohio, was this very gifted spiritualist with this talent for speaking with the dead. So those were my 3 assignments. And you gave me a question, and I went like this. And the question was, did I know what I was writing about?
When did you know that you would write a book, and what did you think you would be writing about?
Yes, yeah. So I got back to Ohio. I was at Ohio State University getting my MFA in creative writing, and I went to my thesis advisor and said, oh my God, I'm writing an essay, and I'm writing another essay, and I think I've got 14 or 15 or 16 or maybe 42 essays. Like, there's so much, I can't stop writing. And he looked at me, and this was Lee Martin, the Pulitzer Prize finalist novelist, who was my thesis advisor at the time. He said, Rebe, you're writing a book. You're not writing an essay. You're not, forget that. That was so yesterday. You're writing a book. And it was like, oh, thank God. Because, and I was like, oh my God, how do you write a book, right? But it felt like there was so much to say. And in fact, there was so much to say. I wrote the first draft of this in a fever because I wanted to just commit to the page everything I'd experienced in Cuba. Because the book is called My Mother in Havana, a Memoir of Magic and Miracle. And it really is a story about magic and miracle. And and it took 6 years probably for me to figure out how to tell that story and to get at all of the different questions of the book, right? What is the mother? What is this thing called mother? How do we connect with the mother? Why aren't we connecting with that here? Or at least in my upbringing, I'll say I. Why had I not had access to that before? Why had I been taught that you shouldn't grieve the dead, that you should move, or that the grief should be, you get a little bit, right? But that really it makes other people uncomfortable. And really what you're supposed to do is put on a face and keep moving, right? What does it look like to not have that? Like, what happens if you don't grow up in that kind of cultural thinking, but you grow up in a culture that says, wow, it's unhealthy, it's crazy not to talk with the dead. Actually, the same thing is to talk with the dead and keep them close, right? So there's a lot to explore, and that took probably 5 or 6 years to figure out how to tell the whole story that became My Mother in Havana.
I don't know how you could answer this really, but there are a lot of memoirs that younger women write about their mothers, and you obviously you didn't necessarily wait, but it became a thing that you, as you just described, needed to write about at this time in your life. And do you think, how do you think waiting, if you will, affected what you wrote?
Thank you for that question. I tried writing about my mother right after she died. And in fact, I was in college, like I said, I was a sophomore in college, and I was taking a poetry class. And I wrote a poem about my mother, and I just laid all my feelings out there on the page. I mean, everything was there. And my teacher gave it back to me with a D- on it. And he thought it was overly sentimental. He thought I had been talking about a breakup. He didn't get, because I had no skills as what I'm trying to say, it was a D- poem. I mean, it was a terrible poem. It was all angst, right? It was all my feelings. I was bleeding all over the page. It was very therapeutic, but it was a terrible poem. I think it really takes time to be able to make something from a deep emotional experience. And so what I think is important, what I would have liked to have told my 19-year-old self was, don't try making art out of your grief, but write everything down, right? Like, now is the time to sit with the grief and sit with the memory and write down, what was my mother, while you still remember it. What is my mother's favorite perfume? What is that funny story she told me? Because what I end up with now is, my mom was funny. She loved words, but I can't tell you what words she found funny. And those were the things I could have been doing, and I wish I had. I wish I had just really, committed all that memory and really, held her close instead of, doing all that moving away. But I think it took 30 years for me to have the kind of distance and the kind of insight or despair. Like, I think sometimes we just have to do things the wrong way for a long time and think, wow, that hurts. Maybe there's a different way, right?
Well, and I do want to move back to Cuba, but I think also you weren't just writing about your mother, you're writing about your father too, and their marriage and growing up in that household. And I obviously am not the only one. I guess you didn't need to read the book, but that was clearly a tricky subject, and that you write about it with such balance and heart. You could have really excoriated your father on a number of counts, and yet you managed to bring that out without, as you were saying, being completely one emotion, mono-emotional. It's a very rich story. How was that for you to write about your parents? Both of them. Yeah, that marriage.
Well, I love that you asked that question in this room of people who some of them knew, both my parents. And I think it's maybe related to your first question in that as a writer, your job is not just to sit in the feelings, right? But really try and find the story and something that might be useful to someone besides yourself and to humanity. And my father was a brilliant, charismatic, incredible, he was funny and he had swagger and charisma. And if you walked in the room, every single one of you would forget I was talking, that you were here for a book signing. You'd be like, who's that? Right? And he was also wildly unfaithful to my mother. And kind of an absentee father in a lot of ways, definitely emotionally, right? So how do you render, your job as a writer is to render people, even people that you've been very close to, in all their dimensions. And then the job of the writer is also to wonder if they should really do that or not. right? Because these are, these are people, and you're telling your story. So I think what I'm saying is you have to do it really responsibly and really thoughtfully. And I have a tremendous love for my father, and I think it's important to the story to point out the ways that he failed my mother, and that many men of his generation failed, their wives, and many wives failed themselves. And that's, another one of the messages of the book is kind of wanting to give my mother a little bit of a do-over.
Well, you do it very well. And I agree. I think that time period of their lives as adults was very, their women really couldn't do much at all. Frankly. I mean, it was a very hard time to be a woman. Like now. Oh well, but anyway, so you did, I think, a really beautiful job of saying truthful things without just completely damning someone. Everything's fine. So let's go to Cuba.
Okay, let's go to Cuba.
Let's go to Cuba. And could you talk a little bit about the part, the big section of the book is what I would call your path from tourist to initiate, which is just really a remarkable account. Very well. Tell us about that. Really? Nice.
So the book, again, the subtitle is a memoir of magic and miracle. And so a lot of this book is, and I recognize that in any room full of people, there are those who are like, yes, magic and miracle, I'm in. And people are like, oh my God, never, like this, right? So I'm not sure what mix we have here, but I feel that the memoir and magic, miracle, I'm a little of both, right? I'm a little bit of, please let there be magic and miracle. Please let this world be about more than just who gets to collect the most marbles before we all die, right? Please let there be something beautiful and surprising about this world and really lovely. And also, what do you do with that? Like, what if the world really is a beautiful place filled with magic and miracle? What kind of responsibility, right, does that give us? So as I go through Cuba, I find myself in a lot of situations where I am praying for magic and miracle. I am praying to be part of the spiritual traditions that I'm encountering. And I'm also wondering, A, do they belong to me? Because I'm not Cuban, right? What's my position here? What am I being invited to do? And also, some of it's just frankly uncomfortable. So for in a spiritual tradition like Santeria, where there's this firm belief that the living and the dead are a continuum, and that we can call the gods forth, and that one of the ways that we do that is through offerings that sometimes involve animal sacrifices. And so there was always, there's always a questioning as I go through some of these experiences. I'm a visitor here, right, and just an awareness of that. And two, wow, this is so cool. But also, I haven't been raised in a culture where this is something that we do every day, right? So there's always this kind of back and forth. Am I observing? Am I participating? Am I getting swept up? Am I holding myself back? Do I want this? Do I want to really walk through this door where the dead and the living are actually in communication, right? And where the gods can be summoned through dance and through ritual. Oh yeah, oh my God, that's scary, right? And so I had prayed for change when I left for these 30 days in Cuba. I had prayed to be remade because, as you remember, I was longing for my mother. I was wondering, how do you move through the world as a grown, woman? How do you build a life full of meaning? I want to come back changed, but not so changed that my friends won't love me anymore. right? Not so changed that, maybe my friend Jane might think that I've like totally gone off the deep end, right? So there is this real dance of inquiry and interest and, being attracted to all of these things and also being very guarded, right? And so, yeah.
So I, you write in the book, you go to meet with people who are, again, teaching you dances, and it's becoming more like you're realizing there's more to it. Underneath it, the dance is not merely recreational, it has spiritual meaning, and you become more aware of what else is happening, like who the dancers are representing and the various gods that they're representing, and you're just remarkably open and respectful, and it seems as if that you do, like you were saying, you pray for this, that the first thing that needs to happen is to be open to it, to receive it. And you clearly have the respect of the people that you're having this experience with, because you ask them to teach you more. And next thing you know, a necklace needs to be blessed for you, and you're kind of on your path. And you're fast tracked because there's a huge celebration of the Our Lady of Charity coming up, and suddenly you're essentially having a new kind of baptism.
Yes.
So this is how you get yourself in trouble, by saying yes. And this is how your life changes, and it's filled with magic and miracle and mystery and beauty, by saying yes, right? So my first experience with Santeria was in my role as a professional dancer. Before I became a writer, I was a professional Latin dancer and choreographer in Chicago, and I was traveling to Cuba in that role and working with other dancers and choreographers, collaborating. And it was there that I saw for the first time that the roots of the dances that we all know and love, salsa and mambo and all those beautiful dances, have their roots in very spiritual Afro-Cuban rhythms that are designed and meant to call the gods forth, right? To summon the gods. So for example, my favorite of the Orishas is Oshun, and she is the river goddess, right? And so imagine how a river might move, right? Or a river goddess might move, right? How does the river move? Very undulating, right? Very, lots of curves and so all the movements of those dances are to mimic the movements of the river and the sounds of the river, and the drum beats hold that rhythm, and the dancers become the river, literally become the river. And what I saw changed me forever, because I was a choreographer and a dancer, meaning in my context, Chicago, it was all about showmanship. It was about technique. It was about being the best. It was about mastery, right? In order to impress, right? In order to move an audience, right? Which is fine. That's all beautiful in and of itself, right? But it's divorced from what I saw there, which was what I saw was the dancers themselves fell away. Their own personality slipped away, and could tell the moment that they became overtaken by the god that they were summoning, right? Their eyes would roll back in their head, their movements would change, their personality would change. And for however long it would be, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, they were the incarnation of that deity in the room. And that's a pretty stunning thing to witness, right? And it's a pretty stunning thing to witness in a room where everybody is buying in. There's nobody who's like, oh, this is a show, right? It's like, it feels really, really real. And And so that was my kind of my introduction. And so when I went to Havana, I was working on the repertoire of the River Goddess. That was my entry point, right? I wanted to study those dances. And that was comfortable for me as a dancer. That was kind of my home place, right? I got this, I'm good at this, right? What I wasn't good at, I was a very good student. Remember how we started the story about moving on, making yourself, something of yourself very good at following instructions, getting the gold star, right? But the idea of actually incarnate, really believing I am Oshun, I am the river goddess as I'm dancing, right? Taking that on, that's really powerful, right? That's something else, and that I struggled with, right? I was very uncomfortable with that assignment. You got to believe you're the river goddess. You're not just acting like the river goddess. You are the river goddess. And so that one thing leads to another. I'm dancing, and I'm like, oh, there was another dancer, and she had this beautiful string of beads she was wearing. They're called in Cuba, in the religion of Santeria, they're called alejes, and they're beads. And just like each deity has a dance that corresponds to them, they also have colors, right? So Oshun, for example, she loves gold and she loves yellows, and so her aleje, her beads are gold. All I knew was they were pretty. I like pretty beads, right? And I wanted some beads. And that's how it started. How do you get those? Well, you can't just go buy them. They have to be consecrated. They have to be blessed. They're part of an initiation. You earn them, right? And how do you earn them? You earn them through an initiation. And part of the initiation is that there will be animal sacrifices. So now I'm at another doorway. I want the beads. I want to be Oshun. I want to understand these mysteries. Do we have to kill animals, right? Do we have to do that? But okay, let's do it, right? And you go through a door, and you go through a door, and you go through a door.
It's really remarkable, and I know I've heard some cringy responses here, and I was preparing myself as I read, and we were getting closer to the inevitable. It was a very moving account, and what I got from it was how incredibly respectful of life the rituals actually are, and the animals, just so you know, are eaten. I mean, they're used. They're not. It's like, I know y'all probably had chicken or beef or something today, so the difference is these people take responsibility for the end of that animal's life, and they connect it to the life cycle and appreciate it and give thanks in really incredibly profound ways. That's quite moved by it.
Well, and it's a really important point with the whole story. I mean, that this is a braided memoir, a woven memoir. I mean, it really is. And the notion of being able to look at an animal that is being killed for a spiritual practice, and realize that you're witnessing a death, and that it's for a purpose, and that you are you're not looking away. I think there's something that happened when my mother died, where I didn't look at it head on. And I think we as a culture here, the culture that I grew up in, is very uncomfortable with death. We don't look at it straight on. There's something very powerful about taking responsibility and looking straight on. And then part of that responsibility through these offerings and sacrifices is that every single part of that animal is used. It's offered up to the gods, it's eaten amongst the priests and priestesses, parts that aren't able to be eaten by humans or set out for the dogs. So it's very intentional, and it really changes your view of life and death. And one of the things I struggled with is, can I look? I wasn't able to look when my mother was dying. Can I look at this bird when it's dying? Can I hold it? Can I be here with it? Can I be here in this moment?
Yeah, amazing. So you move on in the journey, like physically, where Madeline is and the Related Charity are in the same
El Cobre.
El Cobre, and your time is, your month is closing in on you, but I'm very interested in how, you so beautifully describe the lead up to the celebration and the people kind of amassing and the preparation, and you went before everybody came, like a day or two before, to have kind of a private encounter with the statue, and you tell a story about Apollonia. I was going somewhere else with that story.
Yeah. So Our Lady, I've talked about Oshun, the river goddess. The other really significant spiritual mother in the book is Our Lady of Charity. She's Cuba's patron saint. For anybody who's familiar with Mexico's Guadalupe, Virgin of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Charity is similar in terms of her importance and the central place that she plays in, for all of Cuba, and the love of this mother saint. And she is indeed, she's a doll. She's 1.5 feet tall. She's an icon. She's made out of strips of wood and vegetable paste. Very doll-like, right? But she has this miraculous story that she was found 400 years ago floating in the waters by these fishermen who were lost at sea, and they were praying, and she appeared to them. And she has this whole, foundational story that's filled with miracles and all of that. And one of my favorite parts of the story is that there's a girl named Apollonia, and this is 400 years ago, and she was an enslaved girl whose mother had been working in the mines, and her mother had died. And Apollonia, this young woman in early 1600s Cuba, is so bereft, reminds me of somebody else, so bereft that her mother is gone, and she climbs this hill looking for her mother. And she expects to find her mother, because we do that magical thinking. We've lost somebody, but we keep thinking that they're going to appear. She climbs the hill. She thinks she's going to find her mother at the top, and her mother's not there. And so she falls to the ground, and she's so grief-stricken, and she beats her fists against the earth, and she cries to the heavens. And Our Lady of Charity appears before her. This miraculous apparition says, "I am your mother." Right? And Apollonia runs down the hill, and she's crying, but no longer from grief, but from joy. She's found her spirit. She's lost her biological mother, but she's found her spiritual root. And she comes down and she tells the whole town of El Cobre, "Our mother is here," right? And she's here to protect us. And El Cobre, and this is where the anthropology and the research, and all this, also form part of this book. El Cobre is in the eastern part of Cuba. And the people of that town, the miners of that town, won their freedom from slavery almost 100 years before the rest of Cuba was liberated from slavery. And they attribute that to Our Lady, looking after them. And they carried her out into the battlefield when they were, winning their battles and all kinds of things. But anyway, Apollonia, this story was told to me by the priest that guards, her sanctuary. And I just love it. As when I first heard it, I thought, "Oh my God, that's me." That's such a beautiful, beautiful analogy for how I felt in having lost the mother and being able to find this larger sense of the mother in Cuba.
It's so beautiful, and in tying, like your need to go there, and you were wanting to connect with your mother's spirit, with your mother from that line, and you also had this beautiful story there as well of miracle. I know we're supposed to leave time for questions, and we can. But I do want to just sort of pull that together at the end. You open with the account of meeting Madeline. You don't give the full account. You, at the end of the book, you wrap that. You were back there. We see much more of what happened, and also you are participating in the celebration of Our Lady of Charity. How I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but it was hard for me to. It seemed like they were all one piece. It was hard. Like you went wanting to connect with your mother, and so much more happened. So But how did those sit with you? How did that weigh? And what did it, how do you feel now that you had that experience with him?
Yeah, so you'll have to read the book to find out what happens with Madeline. We started with the intention that I went to see him and ask him if he could connect me with my mother's spirit. And that's the prologue of the book. And then I kind of leave off and we get back to, okay, time to meet my parents and find out why I'm going to Cuba and let's go to Cuba and do all this. And then when we meet up with Madeline again, we find out what happens in that encounter. And the reason why I don't say what happens just here, purposely, is it really doesn't matter. It's a beautiful story about what happened, but really the point is not how that encounter went or how any of this, went. It's that I came back utterly changed, and I will say that the thing that changed me is, I think the thing that changes all of us is being open to that change, right? And being open to being wowed and being surprised and being stunned by beauty and mystery that's beyond maybe what we're comfortable with.
Thank you. So yeah, questions. There's a lot.
If anyone has any questions, I can bring the mic around. Well, we did have one online, so I can read it for you. Yeah.
I forgot to say hello to other people.
Okay. Let's see. Silver wants to know, is there a ritual practice you do now that takes you closest to your experiences there?
So the question is there a ritual practice she does now that it takes her closer to her experiences when she's there?
Thank you for that question. It's a beautiful question. Because the thing I do is so simple. The thing I carried back, there's all kinds of things that I carried back. But the number one thing was just staying connected to our I call them our lost beloveds, whether it's a mother or anybody that we've lost, right? Keeping that door open, that invitation for them to be part of our lives. So for me, what that looks like is keeping not only my mother's photo out on my house, but all of my departed loved ones. So I have an ancestral altar, and I've got their photographs, and I've got some of their possessions, and I light a candle. Sometimes I'll eat a meal up there. Sometimes if I'm trying to figure something out and it's not coming, I'll go and I'll be like, Mom, Dad, hey, help a girl out, right? I'm really struggling with this thing. So it's really just keeping that door open, that window open, and being in conversation, not only with my mother, but all of my ancestors, and feeling like I've got a team that's watching out for me and guiding me, and a team that I will join too at one point when I die. Right? That's one of the beautiful things about the Afro-Cuban spiritual traditions, is this idea that we're all ancestors in the making. And what we do matters, right? And the kind of person we become matters, right? We need to earn that position as the ancestor that will then be whispering in the ears of those that will come.
Awesome.
Mission, have any other
Yeah.
questions?
I've got a couple more in here. What did you want to leave with the people you met that would be most representative of your open heart?
So what did she want to leave with the people you met that would be
Most
just
representative of your heart.
most
Yeah.
representative of your heart? Maybe you should.
Yeah.
It's just easier.
With the people I met in Cuba, or the
Yeah, let's say that.
I like a question that kind of stumps me. I think that return. I will say return. One of the greatest gifts and this has enriched me as much as anything else, so maybe this is a selfish answer. Every time I return to Cuba and deepen those friendships, that I wasn't just a visitor, that I didn't just go once, that I go back and I go back and I go back. And the characters in the book, many of them have become really good friends and collaborators and colleagues. And every time I go back, for example, I go back to Our Lady of Charity Sanctuary in El Cobre so often that the priests, and I stand out like a sore thumb in Cuba. And so people take note when I show up day after day after day. Oh, there she is again. And you form a relationship. Then the head priest in charge of the sanctuary comes and tells you the story of Apollonia. It tells you a version you never heard before. And my husband and I got married in Ocobe, Cuba. So this idea of return, this deepening, and actually having relationships, not just visiting another world and hanging out, but really, really digging in.
Oh, we have. You talked about coming back changed. As you come back a changed person, how did that affect your re-entry into the world you left before that change?
Thank you for that question, Jane. So one of the things in the book, one of the characters in the book is my now husband, who was then the guy I had just started dating, and who is not a guy that gravitates for magic and miracle, very linear, very analytical, very like, what I can see, touch, taste, that exists, nothing else. So coming back changed was terrifying, right? Specifically with that, right? And so when I came back, I had to sit down with that was terrifying. And that's part of being a woman, right? Or my experience of being a woman is we always want to please, we want everybody to like us, we don't want to upset anything, we certainly don't want the boyfriend to think that we've gone off the deep end, right? So, when I came back, I sat down with him and I said, look, I've experienced some things and you don't need to believe them, right? I don't need you to believe any of them. I just need you to know that you can't question my belief. And I think that's maybe the main way I've come back changed, is just with that kind of instinct to protect that which I hold dear, right? And I think that we all do that, right? In our different ways, right? What are the things that really, really light us up and are important and vital? And how do we hold those even in the face of maybe it's not
Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you mind a writing question?
We love our writing question.
I know there are some people in the room who are struggling with a structure much like what you achieved here. Can you talk a minute about how a structure like this of braided entities, how you approach ordering of the pieces in the end? If you can shed any wisdom on that, I know it would be appreciated.
I'm sorry. I love the question. And I feel like you've just caught me being the writer that I am versus the writer I'd like to be. I'd like to say that I just am such a genius that I just sat down and like, yes, what's in here, and this in there, and this in there. And that is not the case for me. So my process is very messy, which feels very almost like the spiritual inquiry, very uncomfortable, right? Like you're wading into the unknown. And so what I started with was the thing I knew, which was I knew I'd spent 30 days in Cuba. I knew some incredible things had happened to me there. And I knew I wanted to write those down before I forgot any of it, right? That was the easy part. That was 6 months of just getting up in the morning in a fever and just writing. Then came the part of like, I knew that that wasn't the story, right? Like that's the narrative, but I knew there were all these other bits. Who is my mother? Why did I miss her? Why am I at age 50 looking for a spiritual version of her? What's going on with that? What is Santeria? Who is Our Lady of Charity? There were all these other bits that needed to get braided in. And I just wrote them as they came to me. And then I had a 1,000-page manuscript that was a big hot mess. And then does anybody else? And I thought I was doing it wrong. I would cry. was like, I know this is gonna come together someday, but I don't know how. So I wish I had a nicer answer for you, like, oh, here's how you do it. It's this and this. It was a lot of colored markers and highlighters and post-it and shuffling things around and cutting and pasting. And I'll be really honest, leaning on other writers who weren't in the midst of things, that could look at things very clearly from an objective way and be like, yeah, you don't need that, right? Like, or, and so it was a process. And it's uncomfortable. And God bless you if you write differently and have a different way of writing. I don't know how to do it any other way.
All right, any other questions?
One more and then we'll move to signing.
How have you shared this with your children?
How have I? So I have one son, and he is hasn't read it yet. So and then and I'm the kind of mom that's like, okay, he'll read it when he's ready to read it. And he'll make of it, what he will then. I feel personally like he will read it someday, and I'm glad. And we have a really great relationship. The fact that he hasn't read it isn't like, oh, he hates me or he hates the book. We have a great relationship. He is just like, yeah, the fact that his mom has written a book isn't. He's got other stuff going on, right? But I'm glad that someday he will read it, or they'll have the opportunity to, and that he'll get to know my mother, his grandmother, and his grandfather, and he'll get to know me in a way that, my husband read this book and goes, wow, I had no idea all that was going on. He's going to get to know a different version.
Thank you so much. We've got time for Rebe to sign some books for you. We have books up at the counter.